Good morning, everybody. Well, I guess it's afternoon, so good afternoon, everybody. So, we're going to talk today a little bit about Native American militancy, and I'm just going to keep this real brief, just because you all that are preparing for the AP exam have already been watching live streams um, from College Board, so I don't want to overburden you. So again, this is going to be brief, but if you have a question, fire away in the comment section. Um, or if you think of one later after this, or if you're watching this not live but on delay, then shoot me an email if you have questions. All right, so let's talk about Native American militancy. So um, the success of the civil rights movement is going to encourage other groups to engage in protest movements or in other, sometimes more radical forms of protest. And this is in Native American militancy. So there are some social issues going on in the Native American communities in America that are just causing them to want to rise up. And one of these is unemployment is excessively high. So Native American unemployment is 10 times the national average. 10 times, not 10%, not 100%, 10 times. All right. Um, the youth suicide rate among young Native Americans is in the 60s 100 times, not 100%, 100 times higher than the national average. Uh, Income is significantly lower. The average income of Native Americans is significantly lower than all other ethnic groups in America. So they're just not really being treated super well, and their opportunities are a lot less than the average American. So this is causing some discontent, as it should. Another major thing that causes discontent among Native Americans in this era is in the 1950s. In 1953, the government tries a policy called termination. Now, they had previously tried assimilation. Assimilation is not quite the same thing. Termination is like the next step in assimilation. And termination, the idea behind termination is that the government is going to quit recognizing all Native American tribes as sovereign or legal entities. So termination is going to strip rights away from Native Americans because um, court rulings in the 1800s had given Native Americans kind of carte blanche. The only authority that was over them was the federal government. The federal government was like a protectorate over them. But now the federal government is pursuing legislation that would strip these rights away from Native Americans. So we see in the early 60s the Indian civil rights movement starts. And it starts in 1961 in earnest. And what they're pushing for is, quote, the right to choose our own way of life. So they don't want to be forced by the government to choose a certain path in life. They don't want to be forced by the government to assimilate. They want to choose whatever they will, which is pretty much a fundamental right of human beings, particularly in America. So they're pushing for equality in their minds. And this kicks off much more radically by 1968. So in 1968, the American Indian movement kind of gained momentum, and this is a more radical faction of the Indian civil rights movement. And uh, they actually win the passage of the Indian Civil Rights Act in 1968, and this is going to stop termination. So it took, from 1953 to 1968 to stop termination, but termination is terminated with the Indian Civil Rights Act, largely because of the Indian Civil Rights Movement and the American Indian Movement working together. Now, this is also then going to spawn the occupation movement. And this is where, in protest, Native Americans are going to actually occupy areas, illegally occupy areas for extended periods of time. Now, this is, something in modern times that you could draw a connection to. If you're going to make a connection, something you can make a connection to would be Occupy Wall Street. All right, so Occupy Wall Street would be an example of a modern movement occupying somewhere in protest. But some occupation movements that Native Americans engaged in this era, one would be Alcatraz in 1969, where a group of Native Americans they claimed they had first rights to Alcatraz by discovering it and occupying the land long before Europeans came and settled, and long before America had claim to it. So they're going to occupy Alcatraz. It had been abandoned. Alcatraz wasn't an active prison at this point in time, and they occupy it for quite a while until it just kind of breaks down. There were some issues. There was a drug overdose that occurred, and there were other issues as far as logistics, getting food, and things like that. Um, but it's an occupation movement in 1969. Then in 1972, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was occupied for 6 days by a group of Native Americans. And then I think the most famous one is the occupation of Wounded Knee in 1973. And Wounded Knee was the site of a massacre of Native Americans by the U.S. military in the 1800s. And so this has symbolic significance. Uh, and Wounded Knee is occupied for quite a while. Um, but the occupation sends a political message and it gains press for the American Indian movement. Um, Other groups that also are pushing for and gain some civil rights in this era as well. Latinos push for civil rights, and Cesar Chavez pushes for the right to unionize migrant workers. And we see this in 1965. And we also see some more press for this in 1968 with Robert Kennedy as well, kind of like pushing for Latino rights. But then obviously Robert Kennedy's assassinated in '68. Um, Also, your book mentioned, so I will cover it, but this is just something to keep in mind in case it's on the AP exam. And that would be the gay liberation movement, which was seen as starting off in the Stonewall riots in 1969, where some police came to enforce the law at a gay bar, and homosexual patrons tried to murder them by trapping the police officers inside and then setting fire to the building. And this is seen as kind of like the beginning of the gay liberation movement. So that is what it is. I just cover that for the sake of covering the content that may be on the exam. So big thing today, civil rights movement is going to lead to other groups wanting to push for civil rights. One group is Native Americans. Then there's the Latino civil rights movement under Cesar Chavez, and then there's the gay liberation movement as well. All right. Any questions that anyone has for me? All right, then. If you have any questions or think of anything, please email me. Otherwise, have a great day, everybody.